The last light of day bled over the plains, painting the horizon in smears of rust and gold. A thin wind came crawling off the prairie, sharp enough to make the wooden walls of the trading post groan. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of tobacco, tanned hides, and the faint, bitter scent of cheap whiskey. Annie Mae Carson stood in the corner, small and still, her bare toes curling against the splintered floorboards. She was 12, but her frame was slight enough to pass for younger. Her hands twisted at the hem of her faded calico dress as her uncle, Jedediah Carson, leaned lazily against the counter, a half-empty bottle swaying in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard wild. Across from him stood a man who seemed carved from the earth itself, a Creek warrior with broad shoulders and a face as unreadable as stone. His black hair was bound in 2 long braids, and an eagle feather swayed gently with each breath. A heavy wool blanket, striped in muted reds and browns, was thrown across one shoulder. His name, Annie Mae would later learn, was Tuklo Blackhawk. Between them lay the terms of their meeting, 2 thick beaver pelts, dark and glossy under the lantern light. Winter pelts, worth a good price in town. Jedediah's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "You take her now," Jedediah said, his voice hoarse and soaked in drink. 2 pelts, and she's yours." Annie Mae's breath hitched. She didn't know where Tuklo had come from or why he was here, but she understood enough. She was the her being spoken of. She glanced at her uncle, looking for some sign that this was just one of his cruel jokes, but there was only greed in his gaze. Tuklo did not look at Jedediah when he spoke. His eyes were on Annie Mae, studying her not like a prize or a burden, but as if she were a question that needed answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deep, and steady. "She is not property," Tuklo said, his Creek accent shaping the English words with a careful precision. "She is a child." Jedediah gave a lazy shrug. "Ain't the same to me. She's mine to give. 2 pelts say so." The warrior's gaze flicked to the pelts, then back to Annie Mae. Slowly, he reached into the leather pouch at his belt, drew out the agreed payment, and set the pelts on the table. But when he spoke next, his words were not for Jedediah, they were for her. "You will come with me," Tuklo said softly. "No one will harm you." Annie Mae's heart beat hard enough she could hear it in her ears. She had never been given a choice before, not by her uncle, not by anyone. Yet something in Tuklo's tone made it sound less like an order and more like a promise. Jedediah scooped up the pelts with a satisfied grunt. "She's all yours. Don't bring her back." Tuklo stepped forward, offering his hand. For a moment, Annie Mae hesitated, glancing back toward the dim, drafty shack that had been her home. She saw the peeling wallpaper, the table with its missing leg propped up by a brick, the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners even in daylight. She thought of the nights she'd gone to bed hungry, the mornings she'd been sent to work. Before the sun came up, and then she looked at Tuklo's hand, broad, strong, steady, and she made her choice. She slipped her small fingers into his dot. The door creaked as they stepped outside, the cold hitting her like a slap. The sky was awash of stars, the moon low and full. Tuklo led her to where his horse waited, a paint mare with eyes as calm as his own. As he helped her into the saddle, she heard Jedediah's voice drift from inside the shack, already calling for another drink. He hadn't even bothered to watch her go. Tuklo swung up behind her, the warmth of his chest against her back, cutting the chill of the wind. "Hold on," he murmured, and just like that, Annie Mae Carson left behind the only family she had known, not for love, not for fortune, but for something she couldn't yet name. It would take time to understand that what Tuklo had offered her that night was more than safety. It was dignity. And in the cold, wide silence of the plains, dignity could mean everything. The prairie stretched out like a frozen sea under the pale moonlight. Tuklo's paint Mari moved with the steady rhythm of an animal that knew the land as well as it knew the feel of its rider's weight. Annie Mae sat in front of him, her small hands gripping the coarse leather of the saddle horn, the heat from his chest a shield against the biting wind. They rode in silence. The only sounds the crunch of hooves on frost-hardened earth and the faint jingle of the warrior's gear. Annie Mae didn't know where they were going, only that they were headed away from the trading post, away from her uncle, away from the life she'd always known. After what felt like hours, Tuklo slowed the horse and guided it toward the edge of a narrow creek lined with skeletal willows. The water moved in a whisper, thin sheets of ice clinging to the banks. He swung down easily, then lifted Annie Mae from the saddle as though she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. "Stay close," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying over the rustle of the creek. Annie Mae followed as he led the Mari into a small clearing, half sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. Tuklo tied the horse loosely, letting her nose at the sparse winter grass, then began gathering fallen branches. He moved with a kind of deliberate grace, no wasted motion, no sound louder than the whisper of his moccasins on snow. Annie Mae hugged herself, shivering, unsure whether she should speak. But when Tuklo knelt by a ring of stones and struck flint to steel, she found her voice. "Why? Why did you take me?" she asked, her words trembling in the cold air. He didn't look up from the spark he coaxed into a small flame. "Because no child should be traded like a knife or a horse." The fire began to crackle, sending orange light across the snow. Tuklo rose and pulled a thick wool blanket from his saddlebag. He stepped behind her, draped it over her shoulders, and pulled it snug around her, tucking the edges in as if sealing her against the cold. "You are safe here," he told her. His tone wasn't soft, but it was certain, like the way a man might state the position of the moon or the path of the river. She lowered herself onto the ground near the fire, her fingers warming slowly. She wanted to believe him. She wanted it more than she'd wanted anything in a long time. Tuklo crouched across from her, stirring a small pot of something that smelled faintly of corn and smoked meat. After a while, he reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a smooth wooden bead. It was small, polished from years of touch, and carved with faint patterns. "This was given to me," he said, holding it up so the firelight caught its surface. "When I was a boy, on the night I proved I could stand for my people." Annie Mae looked from the bead to his face. "Why are you showing it to me?" "Because it is not traded," he said, "not sold. It is kept until the time comes to give it in honor." He reached across the fire and placed the bead in her palm, then closed her small fingers around it. "Tonight," he said simply, "it is yours." Annie Mae didn't know what kind of worth the bead held among his people, but she could feel its importance, like a small heartbeat in her hand. No one had ever given her anything like this, not something bought, not something taken, but something meant. The fire popped, sending a small flurry of sparks into the night. Tuklo leaned back, resting on one knee. "We travel tomorrow," he said. "The way will be long." She nodded, eyes heavy from the warmth and the rhythm of his voice. The bead remained in her hand even as her fingers loosened in sleep. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. The creek whispered on, carrying its water toward a place she could not yet imagine. And above it all, Annie Mae slept under a stranger's protection, though already she knew he was not a stranger at all. By the third day, the land had begun to change. The flat, open prairie was giving way to rolling hills and stands of bare hickory and oak, their twisted branches scratching at the pale winter sky. The snow here lay thinner, but the air carried a heavier stillness, as if every sound waited for permission to move. Annie Mae rode in front of Tuklo again, her small frame wrapped in the thick blanket he'd given her. She had learned by now to read the horse's rhythm, to feel the way her muscles moved beneath the saddle, and to keep her balance without clutching the horn quite so tightly. Still, she never loosened her grip on the wooden bead he had given her. It lived in her pocket by day, in her palm by night. Just before noon, they came upon a narrow trail where the snow had been trampled by many feet and hooves. Tuklo slowed the mare to a walk, scanning the trees. His head turned slightly, the eagle feather in his hair brushing her cheek as he spoke low. "We are close," he said. "This land belongs to my people." Not long after, the quiet broke. From the shadows between the trees emerged 3 men on horseback, all Creek warriors. They wore heavy winter buckskin and carried long rifles. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and a scar running from his cheek to his jaw, rode forward. Tuklo halted the mare. Annie Mae felt the warrior's arm settle lightly across her middle, not to restrain her, but as a shield. The man with the scar stopped just short of them, his gaze moving from Tuklo to her, and then back again. The 2 men exchanged words in Creek. Annie Mae couldn't follow the meaning, but she could feel the weight of it. The scarred man's tone was challenging, questioning. Tuklo's reply was calm, measured. The other warriors stayed mounted behind their leader, watching with unreadable expressions. Annie Mae's eyes flicked between them, her pulse quickening. She had the sudden, foolish thought that maybe they would send her back, that they would decide she didn't belong here after all. The conversation grew quiet. Then, unexpectedly, the scarred man dismounted. He stepped forward, crouching until his eyes were level with hers. His gaze was steady, not unkind, but searching, as if trying to see past her skin, her clothes, even her name, for what felt like. A long time, he simply studied her. Then, without a word, he nodded once. Tuklo gave a small incline of his head, almost imperceptible. The man rose, mounted his horse again, and spoke to the others. They turned back toward the trees, vanishing into the hills as silently as they had come. Only when the forest swallowed them did Annie Mae find her voice. What did he say?" Tuklo urged the mare forward at a walk. He asked why I would give 2 pelts for a girl who is not Creek. "And what did you tell him?" "That 2 pelts were not the price," Tuklo said. Honor was the price. She let those words settle in her mind as they rode. Honor. It was not a word she had heard often, and never in connection to herself. She thought about how Jedediah had looked at her like a thing to be rid of, a burden traded away for a few scraps of worth. And then she thought of the way Tuklo had looked at her that first night, not like property, not like a mistake, but like something that mattered. The trail wound upward, cresting a ridge where the land opened into a wide valley. Smoke curled from distant lodges, and the faint sound of drumming carried on the wind. Tuklo reined in the mare, letting her take in the sight. "That is my home," he said. "Soon it will be yours as well." Annie Mae didn't answer right away. She was still trying to understand the way those words made her feel, how something inside her chest seemed to loosen, like a knot untied after years of pulling tight. They rode on, the snow crunching under the mare's hooves, the drumming growing clearer with each step. Somewhere ahead lay a place where she might belong, but she also knew, in the quiet certainty that sometimes comes before truth is spoken, that belonging was never simply given. It was earned, and if honor was the price, she was beginning to hope she could pay it. The drumming grew louder as they descended into the valley, the rhythm deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Annie Mae could smell the faint tang of wood smoke before she could make out the shapes of the lodges. Tuklo guided the paint mare along a narrow track that wound between bare willow stands and frozen patches of cattail marsh. The snow here was trampled with many footprints, women carrying bundles, children chasing each other, men leading horses heavy with firewood. People paused in their work to look up as they passed, their eyes sliding from Tuklo to the small figure. In front of him, no one spoke at first, but Annie Mae could feel the weight of their gazes. Some faces were unreadable, others openly curious. One boy about her age stared until his mother gently took him by the shoulder and steered him away. The lodges came into full view, some framed in bent saplings and covered in hides. Others built of timber, smoke curling from holes in their roofs. Brightly dyed cloths hung to dry in the weak sunlight, and strips of meat dangled from racks near the fires. The air smelled of cooking venison, tanned hides, and cedar smoke. Tuklo stopped before a lodge larger than the rest. A woman stepped out to meet them, tall, with gray-streaked hair bound in a long braid and a face lined with years but not softened by them. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with blue and white beadwork, and her gaze was sharp as a hawk's. Tuklo dismounted first, then lifted Annie Mae down. His hand was steady, the way it had been when he first helped her onto the horse that night. He spoke to the woman in Creek, his tone respectful but sure. Annie Mae caught the sound of her own name. In the midst of words she didn't know, the woman's eyes moved over her, taking in the calico dress, the blanket, the wind-reddened cheeks. She said something short in Creek, her voice low and measured. Tuklo replied, then gestured toward Annie Mae, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder. The woman gave a small nod and turned, disappearing into the lodge. Tuklo motioned for Annie Mae to follow. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of burning cedar. The floor was lined with woven mats, and bundles of furs were stacked neatly along one wall. The woman was kneeling by the fire pit, adding a log. She spoke again to Tuklo, who answered without hesitation. Finally, the woman looked directly at Annie Mae and spoke in halting English. I am Tuklo's mother. My name is Sula. Annie Mae swallowed, unsure if she should curtsy, bow, or simply stand still. My name's Annie Mae, she said softly. Sula studied her for a long moment before replying. You will eat here. You will sleep here. You will work here. Her tone carried no malice, only fact, as if she were stating the rules of the wind or the snow. Tuklo translated a few words back into Creek, and Sula nodded. Then she reached into a bundle near the fire and drew out a neatly folded garment, soft buckskin, stitched with red thread. She placed it into Annie Mae's hands. You wear this, Sula said. Annie Mae looked at the dress, then at her own thin calico, frayed and faded from too many washings. The buckskin was warm to the touch, heavier than it looked. She nodded, murmuring, Thank you, though her voice was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. That night, after a supper of venison stew and flatbread, Annie Mae lay on a bed of furs beside the fire. The murmur of Creek voices floated through the lodge walls, mixing with the steady beat of a distant drum. She clutched the wooden bead in her fist and thought about what Sula had said. You will eat here. You will sleep here. You will work here. It was not the welcome she might have dreamed of, but it was not the dismissal she had always known. For the first time in years, she was in a place where she was not waiting to be sent away. Outside, the drum went on beating into the night. She began to wonder if it might never stop. Morning came with the sound of women's voices outside the lodge, speaking quick Creek words Annie Mae could not yet understand. The air inside was cool. The fire had burned low in the night, but Sula was already up, stoking it back to life. You come, Sula said, pointing to the door flap. She spoke in English only when she had to, her tone clipped but not unkind. Annie Mae rose, clutching the buckskin dress to her chest. Outside, the valley was silvered with frost. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and the smoke from the lodges drifted in low blue ribbons. Women moved about with purpose, fetching water, tending fires, cutting strips of meat to hang on racks. Sula handed Annie Mae a clay pot. Water, she said, gesturing toward the creek. Tuklo's voice came from somewhere behind her low, explaining something in Creek to his mother. Annie Mae caught the sound of her own name again but couldn't make out the rest. The path, too. The creek was slick with ice, and she had to take small, careful steps. A few children followed at a distance, whispering and giggling behind their mittened hands. She pretended not to notice. The creek water was so cold it burned her fingers, and she had to bite her lip to keep from gasping as she filled the pot. By the time she returned to Sula's lodge, her arms ached from carrying it, but she managed not to spill a drop. Sula gave her a brief nod approval, or at least acknowledgement, and set the pot by the fire. The day unfolded in quiet tasks. Sula showed her how to scrape a hide clean with a bone tool, the muscles in her forearms straining with each pull. Annie Mae's own strokes were weak and uneven at first, but she copied Sula's rhythm as best she could. Later, she was given a small knife to slice thin strips of meat for drying. No one praised her, but no one took the knife away either. That felt like something. When Tuklo returned from somewhere beyond the ridge with a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder, the other men greeted him with nods. He brought the rabbits to Sula, who began skinning them with quick, sure motions. Annie Mae watched, fascinated by the way her hands moved efficient, almost like she was telling a story with each cut. That night, after the rabbits had been roasted and the meal shared, Tuklo handed Annie Mae a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a slender length of rawhide cord and several small carved beads, some wooden, others bone. "Learn to string," he said in English, then added something in Creek. She threaded the beads slowly, clumsy at first, but Tuklo watched without impatience. "These tell things," he said, touching the bead she had placed in the center. "One for who you are, one for what you do." She wanted to ask what her bead meant, but she thought maybe it was not a question you asked too soon. In the days that followed, she rose before sunrise with Sula and joined the women in their work. Her hands toughened. The ache in her arms faded. She learned to shape clay into small bowls, to grind corn on a stone, to recognize the call of the winter birds that flitted among the cottonwoods. Some of the children began speaking to her in broken English, offering a word or two of Creek for her to repeat. She said them softly, careful not to make them laugh, but sometimes they did anyway. One afternoon, as she knelt beside the fire scraping a hide, Sula said something to her in Creek that she didn't understand. Sula repeated it, slower, tapping the hide with her tool. Annie Mae realized it was the Creek word for scrape. She repeated it, awkward but close enough to earn a short nod. That night, lying on her bed of furs, she strung another bead onto the cord. She didn't know if it was for who she was or what she had done, but she thought maybe it didn't matter yet. Outside, the drumbeat sounded again, slow, steady, like footsteps in the snow. Annie Mae closed her eyes and felt the rhythm travel through her bones. The moon hung low and sharp, a silver knife in the black winter sky. The villagers called it the cold moon, and even inside the lodge, Annie Mae could feel its bite through the seams of the hide walls. She woke to Sula shaking her shoulder. The older woman's voice was quick, almost urgent, in Creek. Annie Mae caught only one word she understood: Toka. "Come?" Tuklo was already at the doorway, bow in hand, quiver slung across his back. He glanced at Annie Mae. "Dress warm," he said in English. "You will see." Minutes later, she was outside, bundled in a thick wool blanket over her buckskin dress. The village still slept, save for a few men moving like shadows between the lodges. A paint horse waited, its breath steaming in the moonlight. Tuklo swung into the saddle and lifted her up in front of him. They rode without speaking, following a narrow trail that wound into the timber. The snow was deep here, muffling the sound of the hooves, the only noise the soft crunch with each step. When they stopped, Tuklo dismounted and pointed to a line of fresh tracks pressed into the snow deer, their sharp hooves cutting deep. He handed her a small bow. It was lighter than his, but the pull was still stiff to her fingers. "You follow," he said. "You see before you step. You breathe slow." She nodded, though her heart beat quick in her chest. They moved together, the world hushed but for the occasional crack of a branch under snow. Twice Tuklo stopped her, pointing silently to broken twigs or the soft indent where a deer's leg had pressed. At last, they saw a young doe, its coat thick against the cold, head down as it scraped snow for buried grass. Annie Mae froze. Her hands felt clumsy on the bowstring. Tuklo whispered, "Wind in your face, step quiet. If you miss, you learn." She drew, the string biting her fingers. The arrow flew, not true enough. It struck the snow just before the doe's foreleg. The animal bounded away, white tail flashing before it vanished into the timber. Annie Mae's shoulders sagged, but Tuklo only nodded once. "You came close," he said. "Next time you remember." On the way back, they crossed the creek where the ice was thin. Annie Mae's boots slipped, and icy water rushed over her foot. She gasped at the sting, but Tuklo pulled her steady. "You keep going," he said. "You do not stop for cold." By the time they returned, the sun was lifting over the ridge. Sula waited outside the lodge. Tuklo spoke to her in Creek, his tone approving. Sula's eyes narrowed slightly, but she handed Annie Mae a strip of roasted rabbit without a word. Days that followed brought more small tests. Tuklo took her to set snares, to chop wood without splitting it wrong, to gut a fish without wasting the flesh. Each task was given without ceremony, but she began to understand these were not chores, but measures of her worth. The other children began to call her by a Creek name, a Hyon, small hawk. At first, she thought it was mocking, but when one of the boys explained, his voice held respect. "You watch. You wait. You strike." One night, the drumming began again in the village center, deeper and faster than before. Sula led her out into the cold, where the men danced in a circle, painted and fierce under the torchlight. Tuklo's voice rose in the chant, his step strong and sure. Annie Mae stood at the edge, the cold forgotten, her breath rising with the smoke. For the first time since her uncle had traded her away, she did not feel like something unwanted. When she returned to the lodge, she added another bead to her cord bone, smooth under her fingers. She thought it might be for what she was becoming. The wind changed that morning. Annie Mae smelled it before she saw the smoke, a sharp tang of pine and ash riding the air. Tuklo was already outside, bow in hand, speaking quick Creek to a pair of men on horseback. Their words were tight with urgency. Sula came out from the lodge, a bundle of furs in her arms. "White hunters," she said in English, glancing at Annie Mae. "They come near the traps. They take what is not theirs." Annie Mae remembered her uncle's voice, the way he spoke of pelts like coins. She remembered the hollow space in her chest that night he traded her. A heat rose in her that had nothing to do with the fire. Tuklo told her to stay, but she followed, trailing behind the small group as they rode out toward the ridge. The snow was heavy in places, forcing the horses to slow. Every sound felt louder, the creak of saddle leather, the snap of frozen branches. They found them in a stand of cottonwoods, two men in worn coats, rifles slung, a heap of freshly skinned beaver pelts tied to their mule. Tuklo rode ahead, raising his hand in greeting but not smiling. His Creek words were calm but carried weight. The taller of the two hunters spat into the snow. "Ain't your river," he said in English. "Ain't your beaver." Annie Mae gripped the edge of her blanket. She could see the tension in Tuklo's shoulders, the way his hand hovered near the bowstring. What happened next was fast. The shorter hunter swung his rifle down, but before he could aim, an arrow hissed into the snow at his feet. Tuklo's voice thundered half in Creek, half in English. Leave now, or you leave cold in the ground." The men looked at each other, muttering curses. They turned their mule and trudged away, snow spraying under its hooves. Annie Mae felt her chest loosen when the warriors didn't give chase. Tuklo glanced back at her, eyes narrowing. "You do not listen," he said. But his voice held more concern than anger. That night the village gathered in the largest lodge. The fire cracked, shadows dancing over painted faces. Elders sat in a half circle, and Tuklo stood before them, speaking in Creek. Annie Mae caught her name among the words. When they called her forward, she hesitated. The eyes of the village were on her, but she stepped closer to the fire. The oldest elder, a man with a braided beard and eyes clouded by age, spoke in slow English. "You were given here like a thing," he said, "but you have worked, learned, and faced the cold without running. You are not a thing. You are Creek family." Sula stepped forward, holding a long strip of leather threaded with beads and small carved bones. She placed it in Annie Mae's hands. "Each bead is a step," she said softly. "Now it is yours." Annie Mae's throat felt tight. She remembered her first bead from Tuklo, the cold camp by the creek, the taste of cedar smoke. She looked at the fire, then at the faces watching her, and she understood this was the place where she would not be traded away later. As the drums began and the people danced, Tuklo came to stand beside her. "You walk the path now," he said. "You walk it with honor." She nodded. The snow outside still lay deep. The cold moon still hung over the valley, but inside, the warmth reached her bones. And in her heart, she carried the oath she had. Never spoken aloud, never again would she belong to anyone who saw her as a price.